What did the astronaut's girlfriend say when he proposed to her in outer space? Hi, I'm Angel. Welcome to the Authentic Action Podcast. Let's talk about intimacy and sexuality today. Can you have sexuality without intimacy? Can you have intimacy without sex? Personally, I think yes, but I also think that it doesn't have to always be the two together or the two apart. So I'd like to dive a little deeper into that topic today. I also want to remind you that I will be going back to some interviews in the near future. I'm looking forward to that. Well, I got some weird background stuff going on here in the studio under construction. We often don't agree about whether or not intimacy and sexuality should go together or how much they should go together. One of my favorite speakers, and I think she's an analyst, counselor. Anyway, one of my favorite speakers, Esther Perel, talks about how we need to balance novelty or something new with security and how much that tension between sexual attraction and feeling secure in an intimate relationship is always dancing. So I like to remind myself and others of that. There's not one way, there's not one end all be all way of combining intimacy and sexuality or separating them. It's a dance between the two. And most of us, even if we just have one relationship or we get to just have the one relationship to focus on, we're often dancing between intimacy and sexuality. And I want to stop right there and hit pause and say, I don't think at all they're mutually exclusive. In fact, for me, I really find my sexuality highly intimate, even though I also can share it, with people who aren't necessarily an intimate partner, or even just like right now, I'm talking about it on a podcast. And that doesn't bother me as far as keeping it, so by intimate, I don't necessarily mean private, although sometimes intimacy absolutely can be private. Yeah, let's dive a little more into what is intimacy. What is it? What does it mean to me? What could it mean? What does it mean to you? I think it's, again, one of those things that we don't always agree about, or we sometimes see differently from different perspectives. So let me just untangle it a little bit from my perspective. Intimacy, first of all, is like being in the inner circle, right? It's like being on the inside, intimate. It has to do with being in someone's inner circle when we're talking about intimacy between people. And when we're talking about in a conversation about sexuality, a lot of times it has to do with like an intimate partnership comes to mind, one of my favorite phrases. But intimacy can also be like you can have an intimate moment with a stranger at a bus stop where you just share that human to human connection, right? Or maybe you see something together that's traumatic or moving or special and your eyes meet and you share that special moment of intimacy. So it can be long lasting, it can be short lasting, it can be between, life partners, spouses, um, siblings, mothers and daughters, those kinds of relationships all have different kinds of intimacy. And certainly many, 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 in fact, the vast majority of those intimate relationships do not involve sexuality, at least not in the sense of like having sex. Perhaps you could argue that most of us are sexual beings and bringing our sexuality with us wherever we go. So, to some extent, there's pheromones interplaying. There's human sexuality is a dynamic that's going on all the time, right? So, um, in that regard, our intimacy absolutely does always involve our sexuality. But to dive a little more into what I mean by sexuality in this context, I'm really talking about not just our sexual nature. I pause there because I am kind of a little bit talking about that, but really I'm talking about like the act, the physical act of having sex. And I was listening to a song earlier, can't remember the title of it, but one of the lyrics was talking about liking to have sex and not liking to make love. And it reminded me of an experience that I had not too long ago, which to me was intimate and sexual. But I think to my partner, the person I had sex with, he used the phrase, it's nothing personal. And I think um, many people, and perhaps and probably more men than women, feel like sex is not necessarily a personal thing. And to me, that's more like masturbation, although masturbation is very personal to me. So I get easily, quickly confused up. And what I do know is that I have confused intimacy and sexuality at times in my life, or confused sexuality, like someone's sexual desire, for a desire for intimacy, like with the last person I had sex with, for example, where I took his sexual advances to mean that he wanted a degree of intimacy with me. And because we had sex, I still feel like we have a level of intimacy and probably always will. And perhaps that's because I'm the female in the scenario. Um, but also perhaps it's because um, we just didn't communicate as effectively as we could have. And I think this is a very common scenario, both the male female aspects of this dynamic and also the lack of communication very unfortunately seems to be common, at least in my life and in the circles of relationships that I tend to see and hear about. Um, well, even those of us who really try to be good communicators, it's challenging. It's an ongoing challenge. So, back to the topic at hand, let me just pause there and say thanks to our sponsors, the Sleeping Dragons Company, where you can find rare and hard to find essential oils and herbs and other self love supplies, and the Authentic Action Academy, where we're starting a new community over in the school community with a K. And you're welcome to join us. Currently, we're growing a community of parents and educators who are interested in sharing new ways of doing things in the education field specifically. Back to the topic of intimacy and sexuality. And can we have sexuality without intimacy? Can we have intimacy without sexuality? I say yes. I'd love to know what you say. As I was getting into, even though I say yes, I acknowledge that we often don't agree. We often see things differently, like legitimately, even if maybe we could have the same or similar values and yet still be coming from a different perspective, males and females being a big example of that, but also different cultures, different age groups, different times of life, different goals in a scenario that could lead to us benefiting from better communication, basically in those regards. And as I mentioned, there are many relationships where there's intimacy and there's no question of sexuality because that would be inappropriate. The majority of our relationships with other humans and other things, really, it's really a very, very, very small subset of other humans, hopefully, who we become sexually intimate with. And that's why for me, it is a very special kind of intimacy. And I really, even if I have had sex with people that I didn't know very well when I was younger, um, and on a couple occasions with people that I didn't necessarily even like, just to get out of a situation. A topic for another podcast, no doubt. Um, I did want to touch on people having sex with people they don't like, but I do still think that that is an interesting form of intimacy. And not only are we like sharing bodily fluids, probably even with protection, um, and certainly without protection, but also just energetically and um, again, because of that rarity of the experience, when you look at all the different types of intimacy that we might experience in a lifetime, the few that are sexual make those very special to me. And even if you're a person who's had sexual relationships with, or, even if you don't want to call them relationships, but sexual encounters, interactions with many, many, many people, I still would pose that that is a tiny, tiny fraction of all the intimate relationships that you might have. And and I would say I have had more than my fair share of sexual partnerships, intimacy, and by many people's standards, I mean, not by my standard, obviously, but even so, they are all very intimate to me like even like I've been raped a couple times and even that on some strange level has a sort of intimacy. Now, again, perhaps it's because I'm a female and it happens inside of my body, so it's hard to fathom that it wouldn't be intimate. Um, but it seems to me that it would have a similar effect even for males. And I'm very curious to know if any of you are brave enough to leave me a comment. Could even send me an email privately. I really am curious to know what other people perceive of this or think about this or experience about this because my experience and perception is that other people see it differently, but I also sometimes think that it's just that people are hurt or wounded and they're acting that way or trying to distance themselves from that intimacy. Like my last partner, for example, who has been amicable and friendly, but who did try to make clear like sex to him is not an intimate or personal act. He didn't use the word intimate. I'm interjecting that, but and I guess I want to pause and reflect on if I'm confusing intimacy with something personal. Like, does it have to be personal to be intimate? Maybe not. I guess that's a good point that I will ponder some more. And then again, I would love to know what any of you think about that. Um, so is one better than the other? Intimacy, sexuality, um, or rather, is it better to have intimacy paired with sexuality, or better to not have intimacy paired with sexuality? I've been thinking a lot about how, as a single parent myself, and I'm actually a second generation single mother, I don't think that's good for society, just to be point blank about it, frank about it. I think that societally, on the bigger scale, that it is best if sexuality is paired with intimacy, and I guess I'm trying to say exclusive intimacy, or some level thereof. I'm not, I don't. I think there's lots of ways to do things, but I'm talking broadly speaking for society. I think it's good if people develop their intimacy and their sexuality together in an intimate partnership with one person at a time. Let's say I've tried the polyamory thing, and if that's what you're into right now, more power to you. I wish you all the best in that endeavor. In my experience, it's one way to explore our sexuality and our intimacy and our capacity for intimacy and partnership, and it is, one form of relationship, but it's often fraught with a lot more turbulence than seems healthy, I guess, in the long run. I won't go on about that because, again, topic for another podcast probably. Um, but I personally think that societally it is a good thing when more often than not people pair up with their sexuality only being shared with someone that they are in an intimate partnership with, and that they're communicating with about that. Now, I said that, I just said it, and then I'm thinking, yes, that, and I also kind of disagree with myself on that same topic, because I also think that we need ways to practice to develop our healthy relationship skills, and I think that actually does include sex, perhaps. I mean, I'm curious what you think. I don't think it necessarily has to include sex, but I think, like, why not? Maybe it might as well. And again, I'd love to know what you think. I guess the why not could be that it could be dangerous territory, and um, certainly as a female, I appreciate that it's the female who bears the most of the burden of the risk of sexual encounters, even if they're not intended to result in an intimate partnership. And of course, that includes pregnancy. It also includes STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, which are more easily transmitted to women and to gay men because of the difference in tissue, I think. I could be wrong on that. You can correct me if you know better, but that's my current understanding. In any case, also just chemically, we have a different set of chemistry that happens that makes us want to bond more with our sexual partners, especially after an orgasm, whereas men have a different kind of chemistry that makes them want to fall asleep or leave, basically. And even though there tends to be a lot of animosity, it seems like, around that dynamic dance, it really is biology. It really is rooted in our biochemistry as males and females. And of course, there's nuanced differences. We're all on various spectrums of intensities and, mixes of our hormones. And that is a factual general trend, that in general, women get more oxytocin, I think it is, after a sexual encounter that makes us want to bond with a partner more strongly. And men um, either get less of that or they get more of something else that makes them want to rest and then move on, basically, if there hasn't been some bonding put in place before the sexual encounter. And I think a lot of females are often taught this when they're young. I did not get this as a lesson when I was young, and I do feel like I've sort of learned it the hard way, the hard, painful way in some ways. And, other ways you might say the hard, fun way. Anyway, it is what it is, right? That's what they say. As I was saying, I do think that even though um, you need you need two parents optimally to support raising a child, and so it makes sense to me that our sexuality be connected to our intimacy and vice versa. I also think that we need ways to practice and develop healthy relationship skills, including our sexual skills with like knowing our own bodies and knowing our partner's bodies, and knowing how to, work some moves maybe. So, I I'm not opposed to the sex worker industry, although I understand it's fraught with all sorts of problems, and that's again another topic for another podcast. But I do think that more normalizing of just talking about human sexuality and more communication between people who are considering having sex is a good thing. So I vote yes. And as a pinky finger asterisk to that vote, I gotta say, in the last few years, I've stopped drinking for sport, as I say. Actually, it's been coming up on a year since I had any drink at all. But before that, it was several years that I was drinking less and less after drinking quite heavily for a decade or two or maybe three, depending on how you count things up. In any case, I've had several waves of epiphany, one might say, about how many of my sexual encounters, my relationships were tangled up in inebriation or alcohol or drinking, and at times other in my life, other drugs as well. But for the most part, drinking. And even this last encounter that I had, even though I wasn't drinking, my partner was drinking, and that's why I was recently reflecting on how much that interferes with healthy, open, honest communication. And so, how many of my relationships really couldn't have been good in the communication department because they were so steeped in alcohol, basically. And I wonder if that's the case for a majority of people, or if it's just the circle of people that I happen to know from so many decades of hanging around with that energy. It's hard to know. I'd love to know your input, your perspective. Um, Last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between males and females. And of course, we all have some masculine and some feminine traits, some more than others. And so even though I want to always acknowledge that, and I embody a female who has probably a lot of testosterone for a female. tend to be quite manly by some people's standards, and I'm okay with that. I'm also very much a girl, so it's okay. Um, I'm secure and sure about where I am and where I stand and all of that. And I think because of that experience in my own personal experiences, I I sort of I minimized the differences between males and females a lot in my younger years. And to be fair, I still do in some contexts. I still like to do a lot of things that are considered more male dominated type of things. And I don't do as many things that are as considered female dominated as many females. And again, I'm okay with that. Hopefully you're okay with that. We'll all be okay. Um, that said, I have a growing appreciation for how different I am as a female from my male friends. And in some context, especially in the sexual context, there's some big, big differences. And as I mentioned, there's this biochemical component, which I think is real. I think is substantial. I think it's something that we should be paying more attention to or thinking more about or hopefully coming to a better understanding about because I think pretending like males and females are the same in that regard leads to a lot of frustration, a lot of struggle, a lot of hurt, a lot of heartache. Um, yeah, a lot of pushing and pulling, but on both directions. Like I, as a female, tend to develop expectations of more intimacy, expectation of, it's not even, maybe expectation isn't the right word, but just I naturally bond chemically to a partner once I've had sex with them. And then I experience a degree of uh feels like tearing away or hurt or doesn't feel good to disengage from that after feeling a bonding, especially if I realize, as I frequently do, that the other person wasn't feeling the same way, didn't have the same bonding experience at all. And um, like my last partner was genuinely bewildered by my being frustrated or feeling having those expectations because I think from his perspective, he had communicated pretty clearly that he wasn't, trying to get in an intimate relationship with me. He was just looking to have sex. And this is a person that I've known for some, coming up on a year and that I play music with. So it's not like he's a total stranger. But in my younger years, there were at times that happened too, where I would hit it off with someone and I would think that we were going to form an intimate partnership and we would have sex. And then he would disappear and I would realize, oh, I misunderstood that. Or actually, when I was a lot younger, I would just get enraged and angry and blame and shame and all those sorts of more immature, less mature kinds of things that I still have glimmers of now and then. But thankfully, I can say I think I'm growing out of some of those patterns to a large extent. Mm, that's a lot. That was a lot of my personal story, I guess, that I didn't really think I was going to dive into. But again, I'm interested to know what you think about intimacy and sexuality, and can you have sexuality, or should you have sexuality without intimacy, intimacy without sex? Like even when I mentioned that I think we need ways to practice and develop healthy relationships, including our sexual skills, I don't think that means without intimacy. For me, it makes me sad to think that people have sex with people that they don't really like. And the times that I have done that, it's because I felt that I was threatened or in danger. Um, and again, topic for another podcast, but I don't feel like it's a positive thing when people have sex and don't allow themselves to feel some level of intimacy with the person, even if it's just a one-time thing, because it is such a special thing. And actually, human sexuality is probably the most powerful creative force that I know of personally in this life, in this body. And of course, I'm a human, so I'm sure that's coloring my perspective, but nonetheless, that's true. I'd love to know what you think of all this. I'm going to wrap it up here. It's been a little bit of a late night podcast episode for me. I want to remind you about my upcoming book, The Shift, which is about regulating your own emotions, taking personal responsibility for your own emotional state, learning how to recognize when you're getting dysregulated and bring yourself back into a regulated state so that you can have healthier and happier relationships, so that you can have a healthier and happier life ultimately. So if you're interested in picking up a copy, getting a beta copy in the next month. I'm excited. It's happening. And or participating in the beta course coming up hopefully in January, February. Look in the description. There should be a email there. You can hit me up, get on my list, or find a link to my website perhaps. Sign up there. Also, there's some links to other books that I've already written. I thank you if you check those out. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Give me a review if you're on Spotify or Apple or whatever else is appropriate wherever you are consuming this podcast. I do thank you for consuming this podcast. I also thank you for being you, letting me be me, letting everyone else be themselves. I remind you again to check out our sponsors, the Sleeping Dragons Company, over on Etsy at www.sleepingdragonsco.com. That should take you to the Etsy store, perhaps in the future over to the website again. And also the Authentic Action Academy, a growing community of parents and educators who are interested in sharing and cultivating and creating new ways of doing things. So check us out over at School with a K. It's SKOOL, the Authentic Action Academy. And now to wrap it up with our silly joke of the day. What did the astronaut's girlfriend say when he proposed to her in outer space? Well, if she'd have had a chance, she could have said anything at all. She might have said, I can't breathe. You're welcome. I'll be seeing you soon. Ciao for now.